Hello friends, and welcome to another episode of JStan Studio. I'm using a little bit new microphone setup here, so let me know if you can hear me okay. I think the headset might help me as I kind of move around for the painting. But again, welcome. So I'm Jim at JStan Studio, and in today's episode we're going to be doing some painting. I'll be doing a landscape painting in acrylic here, and what we're going to be doing is kind of a nice autumn scene with some bluffs. Living around sort of the Mississippi Valley on the border of Minnesota and Wisconsin, I kind of drive through the Bluff area quite a bit. So seeing that area is just really, really pretty, and especially this time of year when you get all the fall colors coming around, it's really great. So I wanted to paint something like that. And so for starters, you might be thinking, hey, Jim, you're cheating. This isn't a blank canvas that you're starting off with. But what I wanted to do is just kind of breeze past that introductory part by laying in some of the base flat colors. And I wanted to do that just so that you guys wouldn't have to kind of watch me do this sort of basic stuff time after time, and so that we could get all the way through a painting and I can kind of catch you up to speed with what I've done so far. And it's all relatively simple. So feel free to jump over into the chat, ask a question, or just chat. I'll do my best to keep an eye on it. But feel free to do that. And without further ado, let's jump into this. So what we've got here is an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper. So this is, I think it's 90-pound paper. It's not watercolor paper or anything like that. It's just cardstock, which introduces some of its own kind of challenges with when you're laying in this first initial layer. And I'll kind of go through a little bit of what I did here. So what I did is started off with masking tape. I masking taped all four sides. And underneath here, there's, I think, 5 little loops of masking tape in the corners and then one in the center to kind of keep the entire workpiece flat. The reason for that is acrylic paint has water in it. It's kind of water-based paint. And as you paint that across a piece of paper, obviously the paper kind of wrinkles up and sort of shrivels on you. So having that tape there kind of holds everything in one plane as best as it can, at least. So I found just regular masking tape works really well. I've taped it to the back of a canvas panel. So this is basically a piece of cardboard, really thick cardboard that has canvas glued to it. It'd be something that you would paint on the canvas side instead of a stretch canvas that would be like on a wooden frame, basically. So that's what I started off with. And at the beginning, I just laid in some flat colors here. So light blue for the sky, some brown colors, earthy tones for the rocky bluffs that we'll be doing. And I just tried to kind of separate out some big shapes. So like this was kind of a shape that I recognized and kind of wanted to lay in. I changed colors and went a little bit lighter for this shape over here. Over on the where this is going to eventually be a waterfall here is another different shade, a little bit darker as you come closer to the foreground. And kind of the attempt there is to kind of almost hug the viewer's eye into going deeper into the painting. So you have these larger shapes. There's going to be a tree over here, I think, to kind of bring the viewer and kind of guide them in towards the waterfall, which will be sort of the focal point of the painting. So I think that this will work pretty well. Having these dark spots sort of on the outlines, I think really helps to kind of guide the viewer's eye towards the center and towards where I want their eye to go when they see this painting. So that's basically, for starters, all that's been done. Just basically laying in some very rough shapes, big shapes with just acrylic paint. So away we go here. I'm going to go in and I think what I'm going to start off doing is I'm going to create some cloud shapes up in the sky area. So I'll do that with a little bit of white paint, and I'll probably use a larger round brush for this. So I'm not going for, high detail at this point or anything like that. I'm just going to come over and grab a little bit of white paint out on the end of that brush. And I've moistened the bristles a little bit. I think that kind of helps to get the paint working a little bit. And I found just really helps me as I go in. So I'll just kind of run the paint across. This is very liquidy because I dipped the bristles into the water and I didn't use a lot of paint. And I think that when you do that, as you kind of come across, you can kind of jitter your brush up and down. So just really quick motion like you would as you're writing almost. And I think that that'll give it the appearance of being very airy. it's not going to produce a very distinct shape, but that's kind of what we want for a cloud. The way that I'm thinking about this is that these are far off clouds, maybe they're really high up in the sky or something like that. So that's my general approach there. One note, when I was laying in the initial sky color, what I try to do is, as you go closer to the horizon line, you try to get a little bit lighter in color. So adding a little bit more white, or letting a little bit more of the white of the paper shine through there. I found that that really kind of gives that illusion of depth. So that's something that I tried to keep in mind there. With that, that's pretty simple. I don't want to spend too much time noodling the clouds. But what I want to do now is go into and place some, maybe just some basic tree shapes that are far away, kind of on the ridge line here. So what I'm going to do there is, in order to do that, I'll moisten the bristles a little bit. I'll make sure that they aren't quite as damp as that, because I want these shapes to be a little bit more distinct. And I will go into a little bit of brown, a little bit of white, and maybe just a touch of black to kind of mute it a little bit. And you couldn't see it because it was off on the palette, but what I did is I just kind of tapped the brush down onto the palette a little bit. And what I did there is just trying to get a little bit of that paint just on the edges of the bristles and kind of get the bristles to kind of poof out a little bit. And the reason for that is, as I come in here and I start to make these tree shapes, having those bristles poofed out like that is going to kind of create that illusion of tree-ness. It's kind of going to give it everything a little bit more of an organic shape. And I think it'll just make it look a little bit more like we've got trees instead of, you know, blobs or globs of paint. So I'll just go in and I'll lay that in along the tree line there. I'm not too worried about this edge. This edge is going to be something that's key to selling the illusion of depth there. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to go in and firm that up at a later time. So I'm not super concerned with that yet. So I'll do that for now. I might come in here for a little bit and put some tree shapes on this nearer bluff here. Just like that. And I'm just going to take the color that I have and stroke it along the bottom of these trees a little bit. And the reason for that is I still want that area to be light in color, but I want it to have a little bit of a feeling that as you're going down, again, you kind of get that misty look to it that looks a little bit less distinct and a little bit like it's further away from you. So I'm washing off my brush now. And what I'm going to do is actually with the same brush, I'm going to go into my fall colors. And when I start thinking about fall colors, I'm thinking about reds and yellows and oranges to really kind of bring out that feeling of fall that you get when you see those changing colors. And I'm going to try to get these to be kind of earthy toned. And the way that I'm going to do that is by adding a little bit of brown, just a really small touch of brown into red is what I've got here. Eventually I'll pull in a little bit of yellow. And that little bit of brown is kind of going to mute things a little bit and make it kind of tie together with the browns that are in the rocks and kind of give it a feeling of, like I said, sort of earthiness. So I've got a little bit of red on my brush here, and I did sort of that same poofing, sort of just downward tapping onto the palette. And I'm going to come over here and just fill in a little bit of color. I'm going to especially aim for the tops of the trees. I find that when you do the color, having it at the tops of the trees especially, again, it just sort of sets that feeling of depth. And I'm not going to go all over the place with the red. I just want to tap some here and there, because what I'm going to do is come in with the yellows and oranges as well. So I want to make sure that I hit that, get that going. I think that I'm in general happy with that. And I don't want to kill all of that darker or lighter brown area. I still want to keep some of that. So I want to keep some space as I go in here and I pull in a little bit of Indian yellow. So I'll pull that in, and I think I need a little bit more red to kind of get more of an orangish color here. The red that I'm using here is alizarin crimson, so it's a very dark, deep, kind of bold color of red, which is something that I like, especially for fall colors. Now we've got a little bit more of an orangish color. Go in there and tap that in a couple of areas. And again, I know that I've said this on previous streams, but I think a lot of times where people get frustrated when it comes to especially landscapes and paintings and stuff is that they try to really paint every single leaf. And I think that that's a recipe for frustration and for not being happy with the way that your piece comes out. Because certainly if you're going for something like a style like hyper-realism or something, where you're really concerned with making it look exactly like what you see in front of you, then maybe you need to do that. Maybe you need to really focus on getting every single leaf just so. But for landscapes, a lot of the time, what you're doing is, this is just raw Indian yellow that I'm going into now. A lot of times with landscapes, you're trying to emulate organic things that are far away and have maybe some indistinct shapes. They're not quite so well defined. And when you start trying to paint every single leaf, you sort of get lost in sort of the muddle of everything that's going on in the painting. And it just makes it more difficult, and everything feels a little bit tighter and a little bit less free. So I find that kind of loosening up a little bit, using a brush that's a little bit bigger than I think I need, has always helped me as well. And just sort of letting the bristles of the brush naturally do the work really has helped a lot, I think, in my painting. And for those of you that are maybe just hopping in, painting some autumn bluffs here in acrylic on heavy paper. So feel free to leave comments or questions in the chat. I'll do my best to keep an eye on it and answer whatever you've got. But appreciate you joining me here. All right, so we've got our kind of fall shapes up here. Now what are we going to do? I think that what we need to do now is kind of define some of these shapes inside of this bluff area. We've kind of just got some big areas and big shapes here. I think that it's time to kind of define some of the planes that we're going to see. So I'm going to dampen some bristles here of a flatter angled brush. And I'm going to go into, I think I have raw sienna here. I'll probably mix in a little bit of the brown with that raw sienna so that it's not just one flat color. I think that mixing a couple of colors together kind of gives you a little bit more flavor. Looks a little bit more interesting. And at this point, now I've got to start thinking about where my light source is coming from. It wasn't really a big deal before, but now it is. And I'm thinking that where I'm kind of going to have the light come from is sort of from the camera plane, sort of at a 3/4 angle down. So light is going to be falling on this side of a lot of these rocky places, but because it's kind of coming in at this, you're going to see some of the recesses that go in there. So keeping that in mind, I'm going to start kind of laying in some shapes that would suggest where the light's coming from. Really, that's what light is what the paint is doing. And what I'm doing with the color is thinking about where is the light coming from and trying to capture that and communicate that through the painting and through the colors. This is where I'm going in to firm up some of these lines that I mentioned before, just to make sure that there's no tree that's sort of like sagging down below the bluff line. That would look a little weird. And I'm kind of not doing a bunch of smooth strokes at this point. I'm thinking about rocks and the roughness that comes with them. So I'm thinking about that. I want to make sure that I capture that. I'm going to go in with a little bit of darker color. Maybe grab a little dab of black to mix in with that. So maybe this area would be sort of a crag in the rock. Going to go in and brighten it up again a little bit with a little bit more of the raw sienna color. I want a second shape of maybe an extra cliff face that's coming off here. So that's kind of why I'm stopping everything at this point. I kind of laid that in my initial shapes. So I'll try to keep that as best I can, because I think that that's kind of an interesting piece. And I'll just go along with one smooth stroke across the top to make sure that our edges are a little bit more well-defined. When you're thinking about rocks, like you're thinking about solidity and, again, roughness to be sure, but you want them to be defined and to define those planes that are really going across this. So start here on the next one. We'll come down a little bit more on this. Grab a little bit more of the raw sienna color. There was a little bit too much paint there, but that's okay. We'll come down. Maybe this rock comes down and around like that. All right. So now comes the definition. I kind of put in where my planes are going to go. Now comes actually defining the whole plane itself and where the light is actually falling on these pieces. If I want, I can make another outcropping just by doing that here. One of the reasons that I did the initial lay-in of just blocks of color was because I'm working on paper, and paper really has a tendency to really soak up a lot of paint. You throw a lot of paint at it and it just kind of keeps sucking it in, basically. So that process takes quite a bit longer to do on paper than it would necessarily on canvas. That was another reason that I decided to go with that. Another interesting tidbit that I picked up this time, I don't normally do a lot of landscape paintings on paper. It's something that I'm actually shifting into to try to experiment with a little bit. Something that I found with this paper is that it shreds pretty easily when you put too much water on it. So that was something that I had to contend with. And the other thing is, these are pretty stiff bristle brushes. They're pretty coarse. And I found that that was actually shredding the paper quite a bit as well. So that was just stuff that I had to kind of contend with in the process, and as long as you don't panic, you can kind of figure your way out of things. It's not too bad. I mixed a little bit of white in with that. That's a little bit too much, though. I intend for this section here to be a little bit lighter, something that maybe it's getting a little bit of water, light reflected off the water that's going to be coming down here. So maybe it's a little bit brighter. So I'm kind of just thinking that way. I want to define this plane as it comes around. I want to make sure that I hit this pretty well. I hope that this headset is helping you guys hear me a little bit better. I know that there have been times in the past where I've been using a stationary mic, and as I move around and kind of get different angles on the painting, it can be very difficult to be cognizant of where the microphone is and have the microphone pick me up well at all of those different positions. So I figured, hey, why not? I'll give this a shot and maybe this will work a little bit better. Now I'm going into a little bit of black, and that's a little bit too much black. We're just going pretty much straight to black at that point. I'm going to mix in a little bit more brown, so we've got a darker color. And what that's going to do is kind of help establish some of these areas where things are a little bit more craggy and a little bit deeper into the cliff face there. And I want to kind of define this, push this area back behind this face of rock here. So I'm going to use a little bit heavier hand than I would in other spots on this at this point. And ordinarily I'm trying not to use those smooth strokes because I think that it kind of contributes to a less organic sort of a look. But I think that it's necessary when you're defining features like that and you're kind of trying to draw things out or push things back to kind of set an edge, so to speak. Grab a little bit more black, a little bit more brown, kind of push in some of these areas. And I'll kind of come back in the refining phases towards the end and really push some of these values around and really try to give this a lot of texture. But that's going to come at the end. I want to get basic shapes, basic colors in first so that things are have a certain definition to them just right off the bat. If you don't get that at that point, I find editing to be a lot easier than creating, if that makes sense. So if I can kind of get things in the ballpark at this phase, I find that that makes it a lot easier when you come to the refining, because you're not trying to build things from scratch, if that makes sense. I was watching a lecture, or not a lecture, a presentation by a comic book artist named Brian Stelfreeze, who does a lot of really fantastic watercolor work. Did some of the colors, or the covers for Shadow of the Bat back when there was the Nightfall story arc for DC for Batman. That's really just out of this world, and that was what introduced me to him. But he made that comment about editing being easier than creating, and that was something that kind of resonated with me as somebody who paints, and as somebody who also does a little bit of comic book art here and there. Not well, mind you, but I do it. Push some of these values back a little bit. This is a little bit darker than I intended it to be, but that's okay. I'll come back and I'll fix it in the refining phase, like I mentioned. All right, now what? I'm going to start hitting... I'm going to start doing this waterfall area, actually, first. And the reason for that is that it's going to be further behind, and this stuff all needs to come in front of it. So if I start working out of order a little bit, you're really going to notice it in the later phases of the painting, and it's going to make my job quite a bit harder. So I'm going to grab a very small touch of blue and mix it in with this kind of whitish gray color that I have. Kind of cool things down here. I just basically want this area to be to have a certain smoothness to it, but also to be a little bit random, I guess, because there's going to be water bouncing off at different angles. There's going to be little rocks that are kind of inside of this cliff face that you're not even necessarily really going to see. So I want to make sure that I do my best to kind of capture both the smoothness of this area, as well as have some little shapes in there that might be suggestive of little rocks as well. Now, in order to do some of this waterfall effect here, here's what we're going to do. I'm going to grab a coarse fan brush that I have here. So this is pretty coarse bristles. You can tell that they don't really, I mean, they give, but they're pretty stiff. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into white with just a very small amount of blue. I have cobalt blue hue as my blue paint here, but I really want the majority of this to be white. I don't want that blue to have tons and tons of sway on this color. If you're wondering what I use as a palette, I'm just using an old shower tile. So that's not fancy, but it's what I used ever since my teen years. I think we had one, my parents had one sitting in the basement somewhere, and I grabbed that, and I've been using it ever since. Now, what I'm going to do with this fan brush is, because the bristles are naturally fanned out, I'm going to try to dry it off a little bit so that the bristles don't stick together quite so much. And I'm just going to kind of come across and then pull down. Come across and then pull down. And what that does is it kind of breaks the paint up in a way that looks very organic and natural. It kind of gives the impression of water falling, more or less. So I'll go in and I'll grab a little bit more. And every now and then I'm just going to kind of introduce a little spot where maybe there's a rock that this water has struck and is now flipping over and kind of swirling around inside of the waterfall. So I want to make sure that I get this area down. Maybe there's a rock here that it's hitting and falling around. And to fall here. And I don't want to do too much. I just want to kind of give that suggestion. Again, a lot of what we're doing is almost creating optical illusions here that suggest certain things to the eye. Grab a little bit more white paint. I'm running out. There we go. A little bit there. And I'll probably come back and highlight this area a little bit more as well. But right now, this is what we've got, and I'm relatively happy with this. So as things kind of come down here, what we're going to do is, where the water meets the rock face here, we're going to want to really blur that because there's going to be all kinds of water that's splishing and splashing around there. So you're not really going to see this at all, really. And we're going to want to give it some jolts upward, kind of jolt it around, because there's a lot of energy in this water right now. It's very energetic as it hits that surface, and I'm allowing the brush to get a little bit dry over here so that it's kind of creating some of those dry brush effects that look a little bit like you've kind of scrubbed it away or something like that. Kind of creates a sort of misty feel to things, and I'm going to just continue to do that all the way through. I think that as you go along, there's a lot of rapids, they're not rapids, but white water pieces that you would see in here as they kind of splish and splash around and kind of travel over this water. Side note, that was why I left this so dark in here. I really used a dark blue color, if you noticed. I didn't mention that at the beginning, but I did that deliberately because I knew that there was going to be a lot of white water that was going to be going over the top of this. And I wanted to keep that dark so there would be that distinctness where you see that this is deep down into the bluffs, but it still has enough darkness that that white really shows over the top. And as we go along, I'm just going to keep putting in this white rapid sort of a look, but I'm going to kind of let it die out as we go to the side. And there's a reason for that. And the reason is what I mentioned at the beginning. I still want the sides of this to be dark, because that's going to kind of hug the viewer's eye into the middle, into the focal points of the painting where I really want them to be looking. You know, it's part of creating a painting is to be able to really guide the viewer's eye. You don't want to kind of make it questionable as to what's happening there. You want to kind of guide them to where it is that you're intending them to look and make the subject simple for the most part, easy to understand. I mean, some of the art and artistry comes into when are you trying to not have the subject matter be simple or easy to understand. You know, maybe there's some greater message that you want to kind of transmit to people. But for a painting like this, I'm not going quite in that direction, for sure. All right, I'm going to grab another little dab of white at the top and really kind of just firm up this line in the sky. And I'll go into some of the details here. Just grab a little bit of white, dial it down a little bit. And I'm using really light strokes here to just barely pull some of the paint off with the brush. If you get too much paint on your brush, it's a really good idea. I don't have one, because if you've watched any of these streams, you know that I say a rule and then immediately apologize for breaking it. But I don't have one with me, but a paper towel is a great thing to have on hand as you're doing a painting, to be able to wipe off a little bit of excess paint, or if you need to smudge something, they're lifesavers. All right. So we've got that to the point where I'm relatively happy with this waterfall at this point. I might do a little bit of refinement later. I want to kind of brighten up this area a little bit. And I'm just coming in with pure white now and adding a couple little dabs and flicks of white paint at the base here to kind of give that feeling of energy and motion in the water. I like it. Looking good. Awesome. And I'll do a little bit out here as well. You'll notice that I tend to work in a way that probably is pretty maddening to some of the painters out there. I really do kind of jump around in between phases and in between sections of the painting and stuff like that. It's just how I've always worked, so I'm sorry if it drives you nuts. Sometimes it drives me nuts too, but it's just very natural for me to work this way. All right, enough of that. Got the water to a point where we're pretty relatively happy with it, right? Now, we need to work on this area. This is the area that's closest to the viewer, so we're going to see more contrast. It's going to be brighter and bolder and more sort of in your face. So let's get started on that. I'm going to use a little bit bigger brush than what I've got here. Again, I try to keep myself in the mindset of using a little bit larger brush than I feel like I need. And the reason for that is that it helps me to focus more on shapes and overall patterns of color rather than really getting into it and really noodling something to death. So again, this is an angled flat brush here. Coarse bristles, because that's pretty much what I use. And I'm not exactly sure why I fell into that habit. I just did, and it seems to work really well for me. I get results that I'm happy with out of it, at least. So let's go in and we'll identify where we want the, or define rather, where we want the edges of this plane to be. And I'm going to kind of go in there and sort of rough it up a little bit. Let's say that I want another rock face to be right about there. If you're just joining us, appreciate you jumping in. Feel free to leave any notes in the chat or any questions. I'll try to keep an eye on that as I'm working. Respond to those as quickly as I can. Hope that you guys are getting something out of this and that you enjoy watching it. And then I'll do the same on this area as well. I'm going to try to push the value a little bit more in this area because it's closest to the viewer. I feel like it should be big and bold and much more well-defined. A lot of this we won't end up seeing because we'll probably cover it with trees and bushes and so forth, but that's all right. All right, so that's a pretty good defining line there. In terms of projects that I've been working on, I've still been working on getting my Redbubble store up to date, and that's a really good thing. It's getting close to Christmas, so if you're looking for something that's customized for somebody, feel free to look at the Redbubble store. There's a link in the description there. I've got a lot of landscape type things. You can get the landscapes printed on coasters and clocks and a billion other things, mugs. You can get just raw prints of them. It's a cool service. Or my coffee shop as well. I have some of the originals up for sale there, some digital bundles, so if you wanted to download them and use them as, I don't know, desktop backgrounds or make a calendar out of them or whatever you'd like to do, I pretty much give you free reign as long as you know, if you're using it publicly, I just ask that you give me credit for the paintings, but that's, other than that, you're free to do with it what you will. I'm working on defining this area a little bit more, the dark area on the back side of that. I've really liked Redbubble. I think that that's a really cool setup. It's all print on demand, so you just basically say, I want this design and I want it on a mask or I want it on my travel mug or something like that. And you can instantly access, I don't know how many, but plenty of artists' work out there. It's a cool platform. It allows people to support their favorite artists or even people that aren't their favorite artists. It's a really neat setup, though. In the process of kicking around whether or not I want to create a new comic for one of the anthologies for one of the artist communities that I'm a part of. I know that they publish comics anthologies, usually a couple times a year, and the most recent one is Interstellar, is the theme, so I thought, that's pretty cool. I'm a fan of sci-fi, but I don't really know if that really fits where I'd like to go right at this exact second, because comic books are a lot of work. I don't know if I've ever mentioned that on the stream, but they are crazy amounts of work. Good for the soul, but you got to know what you're getting into. All right, so I think we're pretty well set with general shapes. I think at this point where we can move here is refinement. So I'm going to start adding a lot of texture to these rock faces. I'm going to start putting in some of the trees here, defining the water lines along the water, where the water meets the shoreline here. So this is where things get fun, and this is where I normally run out of time in live streams. So I'm happy to be able to be doing this now. I'm really layering paint on thick at this point. I'm using a lot of paint, really kind of just dabbing it here and there to kind of raise the paint a little bit, give it that textural quality that maybe suggests that this is a little bit of a rough surface here. I think the thicker paints that I have some thick body acrylics from Master's Touch, which is the brand from Hobby Lobby. I have some Liquitex basics that are a little bit thinner than that, but still quite a bit thicker than the normal hobby paints that you would get from the more hobbyist sections. So they're a little bit more like artist's grade. And that extra thickness really helps you create effects that are more in line with this, where you're trying to create a third plane almost, or a third dimension to the painting. You're kind of trying to use this to lift up and create areas of texture. So I really like that. In general, I've had really good luck with Hobby Lobby's generic brand of stuff. I found that their brand of sort of the mid-grade, kind of the Liquitex Basics acrylic, or equivalent rather, is superior to the Michaels brand, is what I've observed at least. So I've really enjoyed using that stuff. And it's nice not to have to pay the full price of Liquitex to kind of help the wallet a little bit. So I'm just adding in some of these high colored areas, I'm trying to keep the paint thick. I'm trying to keep the brush strokes small and dabby, if that's a word, to kind of keep things textural. Maybe is a better word. I don't know. For those of you out there that are into comics, this just kind of popped into my head. One of the comics that I recently read was a comic book series called Descender by Jeff Lemire, and with artwork by Dustin Nguyen. I really enjoyed that series. I would definitely recommend it. It's a sci-fi series. It's about sort of a galactic empire in the far future, or not an empire, but it's sort of that idea where everything is all hunky-dory, and then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, these gigantic, like, planet-sized robots come and just destroy a whole bunch of stuff and then leave, and nobody has any idea what's going on. So all of the robots are kind of hunted down and destroyed, but there's one robot that's out on a far away mining planet who ends up being awoken all of these years later with all of his robot compatriots having been scrapped. And turns out that he's kind of the key to unraveling the mystery of these robots that have come and pretty much destroyed a lot of the Galactic Empire without any real warning and without any real reasoning. It was a really cool series. The artwork by Nguyen is fantastic. One of the most fun comic book series that I've ever read. I read that at the local library. So that was Descender, published by Image Comics, authored by Jeff Lemire, and with art by Dustin Nguyen. I can't recommend it enough. It was awesome. I'll go in and I'll do the same technique with these areas of dark, but keeping it a little bit more subdued, because these are darker areas where you're not really supposed to be able to, or your eye physically will be incapable of seeing much of the detail that's in this. But just kind of firming that up, giving it a little bit more of an organic look, and giving a little bit of interest to these dark areas that are forgotten and cold and lonely. Come in here, come in here. And I kind of regard this as sort of entering a little bit of the refinement phase of the painting. Good. I am pretty happy with the way things are looking. I'm going to kind of dull things down because I want this contrast between this rock and the edge of the waterfall. I almost said volcano. That's not the right thing. I want that contrast to be very stark. So just go in there like that. And I'm digging the way that this is looking. It's coming together nicely, I think. There might be some additional refinements that I do off-stream just because I putz around with stuff more than I should, but I'm going to leave it there for the time being. What I'm going to do now is cut in the water line, and the way that I do that is, pardon me for hopping out of frame if I did there, I needed to grab the palette knife. So I'm going to use this short edge of the palette knife in some very loose, liquidy white paint. And I'm just kind of going to come across here and basically just cut it in along this edge here. I want to leave a little bit of the brown below this line that I'm creating because that kind of sells the illusion of a little bit of reflection. Or maybe there's a very shallow area right where the water meets this, this rock face. This is totally a Bob Ross homage here, the palette knife, but I just think that it works really well. I owe a huge debt of gratitude to Bob Ross for getting me into painting in the first place. I happened to be channel surfing one day in the middle of a Wednesday for some reason. I don't even remember why, but I stumbled across an episode of The Joy of Painting. And I thought, you know, I could probably do something like that. And it really kickstarted my interest, or rather reinvigorated my interest in art. So it's really a great debt of gratitude, like I said. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is just go into a very small amount of white paint. Come in here. Dab in a little bit of this very bright white color, so that I can finish off this this waterfall here. And then the next step is to put some trees in our foreground here. So I'm going to leave this area open, but I'll probably end up sticking some trees over here. I think that'll look good. I think that'll look really nice. Putzing a little bit. I'm catching myself doing it, but it's happening. I'm going to put in some darker colors underneath here to kind of suggest what rocks these bits of water might be kind of curling over. It's not necessary. It's not even probably good, but can't help myself. It's all right. There's great freedom in landscape painting, which is kind of fun. I mean, when you're drawing a face, for example, there should probably be one nose on a face. You know, you can't really deviate from sort of the design that God gave us there. But in a landscape, you can really kind of have that freedom to just sort of fiddle around. And I mean, when you're me and you have a problem with that, maybe it's not so good. But it's a fun little thing to do, just kind of fiddling around like I mentioned. All right, so what I'm doing now is using black paint and dark green. This is phthalo green, and I kind of use that poofing technique that I mentioned, kind of dabbing onto the palette, directly onto the palette. And I'm going to kind of create just a general tree shape over here. Maybe I'll put in an evergreen, maybe over here. I think that might look kind of cool. But this will just be a little tree shape over here. And I think that I'm using too small of a brush here, honestly. I think that I could use a larger brush, and that would probably actually produce better results. So that was a mistake on my part, I think. But it's all right. And what I'll do is I'll just create a little tree trunk that kind of comes off to the side here. And probably I'm going to wash that brush, and I'm going to use a smaller brush to make some branches coming off of that. So I'll just use some dark color there, go into some black, maybe grab a little bit of brown with that black. And this is of less importance at this point. I still do think that I'm fiddling a little bit, and I see that we're at 45 minutes. So really quick, here's what we're going to do. I'm going to take a stiffer fan brush. I'm going to go into some brown with a little bit of black to kind of just make us a dark color here. And I'm going to start vertically, and I'm going to go straight down. And I'm going to start dabbing with the corner of the brush, slowly moving back and forth. And as you see, what we're getting is a nice little shape that looks like an evergreen tree. Perfect. I like it. I'm going to grab just a line of brown and kind of dab it in a couple of spots to maybe suggest the trunk sticking through. I'll come in and I'll touch up this area with a little bit of brown. Remember, at the very beginning, I established my light sources coming from sort of this direction, sort of 3/4 into the painting. I'm trying to keep this light source in keeping with that. Everything's going to have to obey the rules of the light source. There's really no two ways about it, unless you're going crazy cubism or something like that. All right. Now, finishing touches. Let's see. I want a big old brush here. I don't want something that's small. I'm going to use a flat brush. Yeah, I'll use a flat brush. I'll just moisten these bristles a little bit. I'm going to do the Evergreen Tree first. We're going to go green and a little dab of Indian yellow. And I'm going to use a little bit of white to kind of brighten things up a little bit. All right, here we go. Start off just with a little dab up at the top. And I'm going to dab in the direction of the branches, but also on the side of the tree where the light will be hitting it. And this technique just kind of draws those little branches straight out and into the open. I'm going to do a little bit on the back side, but not as much, because that's not where the light is going to be hitting the tree. I do want a little bit up at the top here to kind of draw out this from the crevices behind it. That's important to define, I think. Make sure that that is well clear and obvious as to what's happening there. And grab a little bit more paint, brighten up some spots here. Just kind of dabble a little bit in the center of it, but not too much because I don't want it to be overpowering. And I'm going to leave this pretty rough. I'm going to leave it so that you can see quite a few of the brush strokes, because I think that that gives it the sort of tree look. And as we get down to the bottom, I'm going to leave it darker, less detailed, again, pulling the viewer's eye into this scene a little bit. I'm going to clean off that flat brush, and I'm going to switch over to a round brush. Switch over to the big old round brush. And I'm going to grab a little bit of our alizarin crimson, a little bit of our Indian yellow, and go into that. Maybe grab a touch of white to brighten things up. And I'm going to start making our little guy here. I want a little bit more yellow. The orange is not quite standing out enough from the background there, so I'm going with a little bit more yellow to try to counteract that. There we go, a little bit more obvious as to what's happening there. I want it lighter at the edges. That's in general how trees tend to change colors as well. So it's in keeping with that. Kind of keeping this loose and everything. Gives it that nice look of fall. Come into the middle a little bit, but not as much in the middle. But just like that, I think we're pretty well set. What I'm going to do as well is go in and maybe make some little bush shapes over here, kind of frame out the area really nice with those fall colors. I'll give it a signature, but overall I think we're about done here. I'm pretty happy with how this turned out, and I hope that you learned something about my process, about how to paint a scene like this. I hope that you enjoyed, and I really appreciate you coming around. So if you have any questions, please feel free to drop a comment. Be sure to like this, like the video, subscribe if you're not subscribed. I produce more content like this where I'm kind of talking you through my process in terms of how I would approach a painting like this. Oh, love the pine tree. Thank you very much. Yeah, it turned out really well. I really like it. But yeah, please feel free to like, subscribe, tell your friends about it. I really love doing this. If there's something that you'd like to see, or questions that you'd like to have, or content that you'd say, like, hey, maybe you could do a painting of something else, I don't know, a roller coaster or a superhero or something like that, I'd love to try something out. So thanks again for joining. Appreciate it. Until next time, God bless. Happy painting.